website. It's free for members, and there's a nominal charge for non-members. In case you missed something or would like to hear it again, or have a friend you think should hear it, it is available. So thank you for joining the January webinar. We appreciate your interest and your time. A few logistics before we begin. Please mute your computer during the presentation. We'd appreciate you keeping comments to the end, but you can add comments and questions in the chat box at any time. I will monitor that, and as is appropriate, I can alert our speaker to a comment or question for clarification. There will be time after she speaks for an interactive question and answer time. At that time, please unmute when you want to ask a question or make a comment. Now, it is with great pleasure that I introduce our speaker for today. I've enjoyed getting to know Julia Gaspar-Bates while she and I have been on the board of directors, and actually way before that. Last year, Julia spent a sabbatical in Cuenca, Ecuador. I was very impressed. So many of my trips tend to be around business, and she and her family just decided this was an experience that they needed to have together and chose to do it. Julia is president of Intercultural Alliances, LLC, a global cross-cultural training and consulting firm. She's delivered customized programs to thousands of executives, educators, and students, government and non-governmental employees in multiple languages on 4 continents. Julia's had a lot of experience training multicultural groups as a lead intercultural consultant with World Bank. She previously taught as adjunct faculty at George Washington University and currently serves on the SIETAR Board of Directors as the local group's director. Today, Julia will remind us why we need to walk the talk in our work to overcome one-size-fits-all approaches to training and teaching when we're working with widely diverse audiences. Her talk today is titled Styles for Success with Multicultural Groups, and I turn the program over now to Julia.
Great, thank you so much, Sandy, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. Everyone, thank you so much for being here today, and I'm delighted to do this webinar for the first time. I'm usually on the opposite side of this, of actually helping Sandy coordinate and set up speakers for our webinars. So it's nice to sort of be on this side of it for once. As Sandy said, I think that this is a really important topic for us because our work as interculturalists, whether we're trainers, facilitators, teachers, or professors, is to really find that way of bridging cultures so that people are able to communicate and interact more effectively, build trust, and work together. And I think it sometimes is really challenging for us to remind ourselves of also the importance of doing that. Some of us do it naturally in every interaction we have, but especially when we're training, we're very informed oftentimes by our own cultural expectations, and we apply that, and we forget that we have audiences that may be coming from vastly different cultures, have different ways of learning and different styles, and so we have to kind of navigate that to some degree. So that's really what today is going to be about. I know that we have a lot of people who have registered, and many of you have decades of experience working internationally and working across cultures. Some of you on this webinar may be just entering the field and trying to learn some tips of the trade that will enable you to work more effectively. So I'd really like to use this as an opportunity to also have a dialogue. At certain points, I'll invite you to either unmute your phone or to write in the chat box, because I think that the richness is also to learn from each other. I'm certainly not the expert in this. I'm, have got my own experiences, which many of you do as well. So I think that this will be a really important thing for us to get insights from each other on this. So I want to just share my story beyond the name, rank, and serial number that we frequently have. Before I get started, I hear a little bit of an echo, so if I could just ask everybody and remind everyone to please mute your phones, your microphones, if you haven't done so. That will just minimize any background noise. Thank you so much. So beyond what Sandy just shared, I want to share my story, and I'll share this because I think it's really important as facilitators and as trainers that we really establish that we bring in the stories of our own experiences, and we also try to get people to share their stories with the recognition that we have to create a safety of what people are willing to share. So my story is I'm bicultural. I was born in London to a British mother and an American father. And as you can hear from my accent, I grew up primarily in the United States. But that had a very strong way in shaping me because I had to learn how to style switch from a very young age. And even though UK and US are quite similar culturally in many ways, there are still a lot of subtle nuances. So I knew instinctively how I had to behave, for example, at my grandparents' dinner table when we would go back to England, and how I had to eat and how I had to carry myself and hold myself. And I think that those are things that have really shaped me in my entire life and who I am, and also certainly in my work. I've lived in 6 different countries for varying lengths of time. First time on my own was 19 when I went and studied abroad. I studied abroad twice in France and in Italy. And then I lived and spent nearly a decade in France. And I've lived for shorter periods of time in other countries as well. As Sandy mentioned, I was living in Ecuador last year. And I've traveled to nearly 50 countries, either in a personal or professional context. So like many of you, that shapes you because every time you go into a new environment, you have to style switch in a way. You have to adapt to varying degrees, sometimes superficially, sometimes in deeper ways. I also speak 4 languages, and I train in 3. And I don't know how many of you train regularly in a foreign language, but even speaking a foreign language, you're constantly changing yourself. You're behaving in a certain way. You're holding yourself in a different way. And I know that that's something that has really been critical as well when I'm training predominantly in English, French, and Spanish. Because I know that I have to use words in a different way. I have to be more animated or less animated. So those are ways in which we oftentimes style shift. In terms of my work, I work both as an internal and an external consultant. So obviously we all have different ways in which we work with our clients. Some projects may be one-off, and some may be much more in depth. So for example, at the World Bank, where I've been working as a consultant for the past 2 years, I have an office there. I'm in their office a couple of times a week. So even just how you navigate with the client can be very different depending on the relationship that you're establishing and the type of work that you're doing. And then also I've taught graduate classes in international education at George Washington University for 10 years as an adjunct professor. And I frequently had students from other countries. And for me, that was really eye-opening as well, because expectations around how people might work in a team really has to shift a lot as well when you're working with people who have perhaps never had the opportunity to do that. So I think that this, and again, all of you have your stories, but it brings us to the point of how we become cultural chameleons. We're constantly having to step into that space and step out of that space and try new behaviors and adopt them. And that's really what today is all about. So I like to say that being a trainer is like being an actor. We need to set the stage, obviously. We need to improvise and shift gears when necessary. And we also have to find ways of engaging our audience. And that may look different from one culture to the next. Engaging, for some people, might be telling jokes. It might be being funny. It might be doing other things. Other ways, it might be really engaging people in very deep thought processes and discussions and dialogues. So we always have to walk that fine line around that. And I think that line is very fine as well when we are training, because for many of us, this is not just a job. It's part of who we are. It's our identities. It's a passion that we bring in. And I think that what really speaks for itself is the authenticity of our voices, how we're presenting ourselves, how we're engaging with other people. And yet at the same time, we have to remember that we have to sometimes step outside of our comfort zone. We have to stretch ourselves to adopt new behaviors that we might not even be aware of. We don't understand what we don't know. And even being as culturally sensitive as many of us are, we oftentimes forget that when we are on stage. So this is what style switching is really all about. It's how we adopt behaviors that are different from our norms to adapt to the predominant cultural conduct of our audience to reach a desired outcome. Now, in some cases that might work, you know, when we look at what the culture of the environment is, but we also have to be mindful of outliers. There might be one or two people from a different culture that might not respond in the same way. Or we may have a group that is completely from a different culture than us. For example, about a year or two ago, I was working with 80 Russian students who had been on an exchange program here in the US and repatriating to Russia. It was not a culture that I was extremely familiar with. I'd spent a month in Russia many, many years ago and didn't really know their learning styles. They were 18 years old. So there were a lot of different ways in which I needed to prepare myself to understand how to best adapt to them and to reach them. Other times we might have people from 20 different countries. This is pretty much the norm for a lot of the work that I do at the World Bank. That makes it even more challenging because you obviously can't always know the different cultures that are there and the nuances of them to best prepare for that. So I think that there's always a sort of a dialogue internally with ourselves as well as with our clients that will enable us to figure out how we can style switch and in what ways we should style switch. So knowing ourselves is really important. And I think that again, this is critical to our work, you know, the self-awareness piece, knowing what's core to us and also knowing what's negotiable. And I'll give a very silly example of this and simple example, even just how we greet people. I spend a fair amount of time sometimes training in different countries in Latin America, and the norm of greeting people in a number of countries is to give them un beso, you know, just a light kiss on the cheek when you're meeting for the first time. So that's not a problem for me. It probably wouldn't be something that I would do here with my clients in the US. I would probably have HR contact me and talk about appropriate and inappropriate behavior. But that certainly is something that would be not just the norm, but also showing a sense of warmth and friendliness in a number of countries in Latin America. However, if my core self knows that I'm unable to do that for whatever reason, because for religious reasons perhaps, or some other reason where it would not be appropriate for me as a woman to perhaps give a kiss to a person of the opposite gender, I really need to figure out how I can do that in a way that still is going to demonstrate that warmth and that welcoming. And I guess, again, that's a very basic concept, which a lot of what we'll be talking about today are, but it's just a reminder for us in which we can step into that space or not. Another thing that I think we have to do is to challenge our assumptions every single day. Probably most of you are familiar with the iceberg concept. It's a metaphor that has been used for many, many, many years in most trainings, intercultural or diversity training programs. I think to the point where probably, particularly for those of us who are rooted in Western thought, we take it for granted. So one of the things that I personally love about our work is that I also have my own assumptions challenged on a regular basis. A couple of years ago, was in a workshop where there was a participant from Africa who said, you know, the iceberg really doesn't resonate so much for us. You know, we don't have icebergs in Africa. It's not something that would really speak to many people in my country. And he said, you know, what I think might be more applicable for people to understand is the hippopotamus. And for me, that was a light bulb moment for how we take for granted concepts that we use, frameworks that we use, expecting that people will be able to relate to them, and how we sometimes have to step out of that space and to really explore different ways in which people can relate to different types of concepts that will get the message across to them.
Sit.
Hello? Ooh. I hear a cat, so if I could again just ask people if you could mute your phones, would greatly appreciate that. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is hear from you. I think that oftentimes we're preparing for trainings, we're preparing for workshops or for classes that we're teaching, that we don't really step back and reflect on what our own training or teaching style is. And I know that even for me, who's been doing this work for 20 years now, I had actually never written down until I was preparing for this webinar what my style is. How it might come across, how much it is reflective of perhaps my more American or Western notion of culture and my identity. So I'd like to ask you to think about that for just a moment. What is your style? And how does that show up for you? And if anybody would like to unmute your phone, this would be the time if you'd like to speak, or if you'd like to write something in the chat box, feel free to do that as well.
Julia, we do have a question in the chat box. A little clarification on the hippo. How does that analogy work?
Yeah, well, the way I took it from this gentleman is, again, what we see and what we don't see. So the hippo, if anybody has seen hippopotamuses, I had the opportunity to do so in Tanzania a couple of years ago. You only see a small percentage, similar to the iceberg that's above the surface of the water. The hippo spends a lot of time underneath the water, under the surface. We don't necessarily see how large it is, and even if we know what a hippo looks like. So I think that the analogy really worked quite well in the same way as the iceberg does, and hopefully that makes sense. I'm seeing some other people putting in the chat box as well. Portion of the animal is visible with much hidden beneath. So I have Yvonne, who said, I use an interactive style. I expect people to share work in dyads or small groups. I don't like lecturing. Okay, and Abby mentioned that she works in the same way. So I think that that's true for all of us. When I used to teach classes, that would be something that I would really stress with my students as well, is that depending on where you're coming from, a lot of people are educated in much more one-way sort of transfer of information in their educational systems. And I've found it personally sometimes very challenging for people to step into the space where they're expected to share, and that their learning is, in a sense, not taking notes and rote memorization as they perhaps have learned previously, but to facilitate the discussion and the dialogue. And that can be challenging to get people to speak up. I know perhaps many of you have had the experience where you'll ask a question and nobody will respond because people don't feel comfortable speaking up, or going against what the teacher or the professor says, or the trainer says. So we have lecture type, one direction, using stories, and then later more interaction depending on the audience. Interactional style that includes awareness of the nervous system. Activation in the group and individuals toward increasing tolerance for working with challenging materials. Yeah, and I think that that's very important as well, as building up that trust over time. Using the 5 senses, excellent, Patricia. Smell, touch, taste with movement, sight, sound. I think that's a great way. That's something that we can all relate to. It connects us across cultures, but it also really brings in the somatic experiencing. And similar to Patricia, I tend to do a lot of somatic work with my participants in my workshops. I can say that this was really challenging when I first started to do it and bring mindfulness in, especially if I was sitting with a group of male engineers and was asking them to close their eyes and do breathing exercises, or when I've done that with C-suite executives. I really challenged myself and thought, can I step into that space? But we want to get people sometimes out of their heads and into their bodies as well, and that's one way in which we can do it. Yvonne, when I taught at a French business school, I had problems getting people to work in groups. Yeah, that's a great example that sometimes you might be working with groups and with people who are not necessarily used to teamwork. There's a lot of cultures where, you know, even though we take for granted that that's the norm now in the workplace and people are working on virtual teams and whatnot, not everybody has really experienced that to the same degree before. And it might take some time before people are even willing to share if you're working in groups. So how do you create that space for them? Caught up in expressing indignation. That works well among groups with cultures, among cultures with a history of seeing misunderstanding that perpetuates exclusion. But expressing indignation is done in different ways in different cultures, and often people are blamed for their style when it's hard to explain the hidden content. Yes, thank you very much, Cassie. And approachable, quite personable, creating relations seems key to being able to help people over some experiential journey. Great, thank you very much for sharing these. We've got a lot more. I won't go through all of them, but I encourage people to read and to see. And I think that experiential learning and dialogue and role plays, less responsive audiences. I give small activities that are scripted, allow for more spontaneous responses for those wanting it. Yeah. So sometimes we might find that there are lots of different ways to engage different people even within the same group. So I think that this is where, again, we have to find that improvisation to some degree, that I talked about before, that we might be able to play devil's advocate, for example. I do that a lot with my workshops, to really push people outside of their comfort zone and to prod even more. And that might work for some people, but it might not work for others who might feel really uncomfortable being put on the spot in that way. So we have to know how and when to navigate that and to walk that fine line. So thank you for all of these responses. Again, I'd like to encourage all of you to read through them. I won't address each and every one of them, but I think it's really important to learn from each other through this. I also want to ask, what's been your greatest challenge when you've worked with multicultural groups? And again, if you'd like to unmute your phone and to speak, feel free to do so, or just to write in the chat box.
Hi, Julia. This is Manon.
Hi, Manon.
I've recently started to work with some medical professionals at the local hospitals, and they don't particularly want to be there. They're mandated to do so. And I prefer interactive style, but that is not working with this group. So I switched to storytelling, but I'm still having trouble getting them engaged. And I wondered if there were any tricks to getting people engaged that don't want to be engaged.
Yeah, that's a really tough one, Manon, and I feel your pain. I went through that many years ago when I was new and was training teachers for a year-long project in an inner city school in Boston. And it was excruciating every week when I would go in there, because I knew that none of them wanted to be there. You know, I think that that's a tough one, because what I would try to say is, first of all, when people are being forced to do a training and their lives are busy, there's already a wall of resistance that goes up. And, you know, I've found that making myself vulnerable can really, and bringing that human side into it, can really help. You're working with doctors or medical professionals, you know, they're used to seeing human pain, and they're used to kind of perhaps shutting down as a result of that as well, and not always being in a space of empathy. But maybe having them, you know, putting them into even a situation or a role play where they're experiencing that from a different perspective, and I understand if there's a resistance, but you know, I'd like to open that space to others who might even have some experience working with this demographic, who might have some suggestions for Manon as well, because I think it's a much more challenging situation for us when we're working with people who just are going to resist in any way, and we have to find, you know, what is that like one little inside thing that's going to switch it around.
Thanks.
Julia, this is Alex at the University of Minnesota.
Hi, Alex.
Hey, and one piece of advice I got from Janet Bennett that's been helpful is what she calls, I believe, is several years ago, but an inoculation, essentially calling select members of the audience beforehand and asking them what they hope the practical benefit would be as a result of the training, or things they're struggling with, essentially making it really safe. And then people feel like they've been listened to and that you're solutions focused and you're consulting them versus, preaching at them from the high pulpit. And this has been helpful to me for getting that buy-in and referencing that that I care about the insiders.
Thanks, Alex. That's a great suggestion. And I absolutely agree. You know, if there's a way of even just engaging, if this is an ongoing project, engaging with even just one or two people afterwards or contacting them. I mean, I think that this is where it can be helpful if you do needs assessments, which some clients are very open and receptive to, others are not. But when I do needs assessments, I usually do a two-part, depending on what the program is, both a questionnaire where I get some understanding of challenges and different things that can help me design the workshop, but also I might contact people, and that might be an opportunity to really hear from them, like what would be the most useful, and to use those people. So thank you for that suggestion. Anybody else? So I've got, let's see, Yvonne, when I trained in French in Morocco, I explained my teaching style as being American and asked them to step out of their comfort zones and participate. That's great. I think that, the more we can be upfront with it, the more we can be explicit with it, it can minimize some of the challenges. And I frequently use that as teaching opportunities as well. To really invite people. I oftentimes in a workshop will tell people right from the beginning, as far as I'm concerned, there's no such thing as a stupid question, because in a lot of cultures there is, and people would not be very forthcoming in speaking out or interrupting if the teacher or the trainer is there. So sometimes even just opening that space to invite them to do so is very good.
Hello, Julia.
Yes.
This is this is Hamilton. I work with Japanese students, and they're infamous for not wanting to participate whenever you start a workshop. So usually, what I did with them was I prepare stuff for them to do beforehand. So when we jump into the workshop, they're not shocked or intimidated by what I'm presenting. They can actually prepare their answer and have something ready. And then as they feel more comfortable, I can go more off script. But I usually start with that structure, so it gives them a little more time to feel like they can participate in the discussion.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Hamilton. Yeah, and I've also done that a lot. I've worked with a lot of Chinese students, both with some of the MBA programs at different universities that I've worked with, as well as in my own classes when I was teaching at George Washington University. And I think that particularly with cultures that are face-saving, where risk is putting yourself out there to contradict somebody, or even being spontaneous and innovative, can be very, very challenging for certain people. And again, that's oftentimes what we do. We put people into that space. We say, okay, now we're going to do a role play. And even just having people prepare more for that in advance by sending them the information the day before, or even talking to them during a break, and even asking them. I think asking permission is really important as well. I'm just going to read a couple more of comments that people have put about challenges, and then we'll move on. And again, we'll have an opportunity at the end to share some of the lessons learned as well. Kristen has said, language, many participants do not speak my language, English, and having a dialogue is tough, especially when trying to debrief a lesson or activity. I've found having a written sheet of questions in multiple languages has helped. Absolutely, if you're able to do that and you have the the experience and the ability to do that, I frequently will invite people if they have questions. I'll sometimes train audiences which is completely bilingual, or I'll have the majority, and this will frequently be with a group of French people, where I'll have a majority of the people in the room who are French, and I might have 2 or 3 people who don't speak a word of French. And so consequently, I have to do the workshop in English for those 2 or 3 people. And it's very challenging because some of the French people don't speak much English. So I always try to go back and forth between the 2 languages. I will also invite people and say, I'm doing this workshop in English. However, please, if you have a question, feel free to ask it in French, because I want people to really participate, and language ability may hinder them from doing that or feeling comfortable doing that. So for those of you who do sometimes train in other languages, that's sometimes can take a little bit more time, but I just find that it can be very inclusive for people, and then you can just respond back and give a translation of what they said, and that really engages everybody a lot more so. Explaining that people will get more out of the training if they participate. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's inviting them to do so. Some people feel very comfortable participating in plenary and speaking out, being spontaneous. Others don't. So if I find that there's some reluctance with the group, I might shift gears, and activities that I had planned to do in plenary, I might do in dyads or in triads instead, because then they're forced to. The larger groups that you have, the easier it is for somebody to be quiet. So whereas if you're putting them in that space, then they have to a lot more so. Okay, I'm going to move on. And again, I know we've got a lot of comments, so thank you all for writing in here. And please feel free to read them as well. Resistance members teach a 5-minute segment. That can be good, Cassie, and encourage them to develop teaching abilities. I think that I would speak with them ahead of time and ask them if they'd be willing to do that, and not necessarily asking somebody to do that in front of the other group. I've had situations before where I've asked for volunteers to come up and just to spontaneously do an interactive role play, not something that was scripted, not something that I had planned for. And sometimes there's a lot of resistance to that. People are afraid. So, certainly acknowledging when people do that, I think can be really important, because people might feel very vulnerable. One of the greatest challenges I've had is recognizing their own culture and how it relates to others, or being open to other cultures. I think that that's part of our work, right? It's the challenge is people have their blindfolds on, and we oftentimes have our blindfolds on as well. I can't tell you how many times I have co-facilitated and my trainer is speaking very quickly or asks a question and then doesn't wait for a pause for people to respond. So we always have to kind of challenge ourselves in this way as well. Okay, so let's go on, and also I will share these slides in a PDF format. So for those of you who are on the webinar, you'll be able to see them afterwards and go onto the SIETAR USA website to get them. Okay, so I want to just talk a little bit about the preparation. And again, these are sort of some of the lessons that I've learned and things that I've done over the years. Obviously, the needs assessment. We all have different learning styles. Probably many of you are familiar with Kolb's learning cycle, where we're looking at feeling, watching, thinking, and doing in different ways. And I think the more we can find that balance, which again, I think probably as experienced teachers and trainers we're doing, we try to find a style that will be resonant for all different styles of learning. And then also recognizing that maybe when we know who our audience is, perhaps putting a little bit more weight on one of those learning styles than another. Experiential learning might not work for everybody. And while that is a critical part of how we view in Western thought teaching cross-culture, we might need to narrow that down to some degrees, or at least initially. having that. Exploring the participant demographics as well. I think that this helps us understand what the approaches we'll use, and also how we'll design the workshop and our behaviors as well in advance. For example, I know that if I'm going to be working with an audience that is much more process oriented, I'm probably going to take out a lot more information. I'm going to have fewer activities that we'll do and allow much more time for the discussion and the dialogue, because they may want to analyze things to a much deeper degree than an American audience, for example, that would like to go more quickly through things and perhaps not go into the same depth of discussion as some other groups. And it might also be because of the language, you know, recognizing how much longer it might take if you have to do things in different languages or allow for pauses more. Discussing potential obstacles with the client to organize the logistics. This is a really important one. I was training a few years ago. I had 60 medical providers from around the world who were coming in for, it was a pharmaceutical company, and they were coming in for a 3-day meeting or retreat. And they brought me in for 1 day to do cross-cultural training. And I had a lot of folks from MENA, from the Middle East. It was a Friday, and which is of course a day of rest and prayer for a lot of cultures in the Middle East. And so one of the things that I had to do is to work with the client around the breaks, so that there would be enough time for prayer, for example. So to really position the breaks in a way, and the lunch breaks, that would allow people who were Muslim to be able to go and to pray. So that was something that we factored into the workshop. Also for lunches, you know, sometimes when designing a workshop, you know, I find that a lot of times with the US, a 30-minute lunch is fine. People can check their emails. They eat while they're working at their desks. In other situations, that would not be appropriate. One time I was with a client in France, and we actually had a 3-course sit-down meal with 2 different types of wine that was served. So that clearly took a much longer period of time. That lunch was about 1.5 hours. And I think that it's important to really be aware of that when working with a client in advance, to have an understanding of what the expectation might be, and not to go in with the assumption that we can do a shorter lunch. Similarly, just be very mindful of dietary restrictions. Sometimes we have to educate our clients. I have one client who consistently has, and there's a lot of Indians, this is in the US, but a lot of Indians who work for this company, and they have consistently had food brought in that is not vegetarian option. And, you know, and I've had people complain about that, or not complain, but just mention it. And, you know, and I've had to mention it twice now to this particular client, you know, please be sure that you have vegetarian options. So I don't know where the line of communication is getting lost, but that's really important for them to sometimes be aware of that as well. Also, one time I was training a group of Iraqi students. We had about 40 students who had come over on a exchange program. This was a few years ago, and State Department sponsored exchange program, and it was during Ramadan. And I don't know how this had happened, but the client brought in food, very thoughtfully brought in Middle Eastern food, but I think that they were not informed that it was Ramadan, or whoever was ordering the food. So there was all of this food, and only myself and some of the other staff were eating it, and most of the students did not. So, you know, sensitivity around that is also really, really important. Seating arrangements, really important to know as well. You know, in some cases, should men and women be seated separately? I personally haven't encountered that, but I know some trainers who have, where that would not be necessarily appropriate to seat people together. And also just having an understanding what the cultural norms are, or where higher ranking people should be seated. I know, for example, in some cultures, you might have the highest person sitting in the center of the table, and, you know, not just allowing people to sit where they want. So again, something to work with the client on, and just to have an understanding. Yes, it was an ILET program, Alex. I was working with them. Okay. Let's see, I've also had a couple of other questions, and some of these questions I'm just going to ask if you, Sandy or Karen, can perhaps ask at the end, and we'll try to respond to them as much as possible. Okay, introductions. Again, really important, you know, to speak with the client about this, you know, what is the best and the most appropriate way to be introduced. Self-introduction can work fine. I find for more group-oriented cultures where humility is really critical, that it's much better to have the host introduce or the client introduce, and to, you know, discuss with them what would be appropriate to share or not. You know, some information is really important to disclose. Some people will just want to have name, rank, and serial number, as I said before, but others really want to connect and find more commonalities rather than just know what our resume is. So this might include sharing more personal information about our family background. I one time had a participant in a workshop ask questions on salary and how much things cost in the US. So just be prepared for what you're willing to disclose and what you're not willing to disclose as well about yourself. Many of us have read the book, Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands. And there's other options as well. At the World Bank, we have a lot of people coming in from the Middle East and from different countries where it might not be appropriate for me to stick out my hand and to shake somebody of the opposite gender. So I have learned over the years that just instead approaching them and just placing my hand over my heart is a way of acknowledging them and welcoming them, but not stepping into that space where there might be a cultural taboo. I've also had situations, for example, last week I had a Jordanian gentleman in a workshop and he gave me his hand, so that was fine as well. So I think that, again, we can find that way, but I typically will try to greet people to some degree in a culture, in a way that is culturally acceptable for them, even if they're in the United States. Certainly if I'm in their own country as well. I might put my hands together in India before, where I've, you know, kind of done the namaste, which is a typical form of greeting also there. And even just shaking hands. In the US, we tend to have quite a firm handshake. And I work with a lot of students in MBA programs who might be doing internships, who are coming from cultures where shaking the hand is not the norm. And that's one of the things that I'm really very conscious about teaching them, is that if you're going in for a job interview here in the United States, to have a very steady and firm handshake really relates a lot. And that, I think, is a big takeaway that people have mentioned to me before for them, because it might impact their ability to get the job or not. But I think it's also important that I've certainly toned down my more firm handshake with certain groups where shaking hands is perhaps not the norm. Mindful of hierarchy and rank. I think that this is important because when you're inviting people to speak and to introduce themselves, it might be important to know, is it appropriate to ask the more higher ranking person to speak first and to introduce him or herself first, as opposed to just going around the table. So again, just being mindful of that in the same way as where you are seated. I'm just seeing Hamilton saying, in Thailand, one of the things that they want you to know is your salary, and they need to place you in the hierarchy. Absolutely. And I think that that's why it's very, very acceptable in certain cultures for people to ask about salary. Asking people how they like to be addressed. This is also, I think, really important. I was working with a group from, this was a few years ago, from different ministries in Africa, who had come over for a 3-week leadership program in the United States. And, you know, the first name basis really doesn't work for a lot of people. In fact, sometimes as a sort of a learning tool, I will have my name tent and I'll have Julia written on one side and I'll have Mrs. or Ms. Gaspar-Bates written on the other side. And I'll invite people to call me how they would like to, because some people wouldn't even feel comfortable addressing me by my first name either. But that was really important for me to to ask them. Sometimes people introduce themselves only by their last name. So, and names can also be very challenging sometimes if it's a different language and a different culture. So really asking people in advance how they would like to be addressed is important. I was working with a client that the HR director was German from Swabia, which is a very sort of more conservative, informal part of Germany. And I asked him, you know, how, because I knew that in Germany, probably a lot of people addressed him as Herr Doktor, and within the company. And I said, you know, how would you like to be addressed? And he kind of laughed and he said, oh, we're in the United States, you can call me Hannes. But I think that that's showing respect to other people as well, and not assuming that we can use the informal first names as we do here in the US. Greeting people in their own language to create rapport. Now, obviously we don't know all of the languages, but I think that that can open space. I usually try to even learn just hello and thank you if I don't necessarily speak their language. Last week I was doing a workshop for the World Bank where I had 25 people from 25 different countries who had just arrived, some of them for the first time in the US. They were on a 6-month rotation where they were working with different finance ministries in their respective countries. And I didn't know all of the languages. But I did come in and I opened up the session by greeting people in 6 of the languages where we had people who spoke a number of them. So I was able to reach a number of the different ones, and then apologized to the others for not necessarily being able to greet them in 25 different languages. But I think that that's also a way that we as teachers and trainers can really step into that space of recognizing that you know, a lot of the people that we may be working with are having to do it in a foreign language, and it just creates a little bit more sensitivity around that. Similarly with formalities, understanding, you know, certain formalities when we're addressing other people. And I think that that's also quite important. And then other things to create a safe and respectful environment. So I think it's very critical. I don't always bring up ground rules for every workshop that I have, and particularly if it's monocultural, because there's a lot of assumptions that we might make here in the United States that people will silence their cell phones, for example, and you know, not speak and interrupt each other's. But I think it's really critical to reinforce that, especially if there are different ranks in the room, and also to invite people that if they don't feel comfortable speaking up in front of the group, but if they have questions, to come and speak to you during the break, you know, so that you're really engaging them in that way and being very inclusive in that way, because obviously for many different reasons, people might not feel comfortable speaking up, even in some of the small group activities. So really, sometimes I think having a speaking stick can be really fun, even metaphorically, to encourage people to share. To ask also participants if there are any culturally relevant ground rules that they would like to bring up. Sometimes that can also be very helpful. Sometimes at the end of the break, I let people know that I'll be playing music, or I oftentimes use a chime, and that means that they'll have 2 minutes to return, because as we know that the time can also be very challenging. And even sometimes, especially for people who are more indirect communicators, I try to be very structured with how much speaking time somebody will have. And I might use a timer for that. I have in the past, because sometimes people can go on and on and on and on. So if we know that we're, you know, in introductions or whatnot, if we know that people might have that tendency, then we need to be very structured with that as well. Okay, so establishing credibility. Here I'd like to maybe ask some of you to, again, maybe 1 or 2 of you, if you'd like to unmute your phone, your microphone, and just share, you know, ways that you have established credibility when you've been working with multicultural groups. Or you can also write in the chat box.
Hi, Julia. It's Patricia.
Hi, Patricia.
So good to see you. Hello, Cindy. Happy New Year, everyone. Those are familiar names. So I really love this subject. I was excited, first of all, to see it, but also to be able to join. So I'm reading your screen, confidence, arrogance, all of those things. I think this is a very timely webinar because when people ask me, what did you study to do this? I love your job. I want to do it. So I go into my French bachelor, bachelier diploma, and then my 30 plus years of experience walking the talk. I love your, cultural chameleon. So, and to answer your question, honestly, what I find the best tool for me is to allow myself to be vulnerable, is to allow myself to use our values, the dimensions, for example, as some of you know, and you, Julia, I'm very relationship oriented, and it shows a lot in my second, or should I say my first nationality, which is French. But then when I'm in work mode, I am in the American personality. So bringing that to the table and showing how this shifts, allow myself to be vulnerable, allowing my participants to laugh with and at me sometimes, also gives them an opportunity to be okay with not being right all the time, to know that everything's going to be okay and that they have it within themselves as well to shift and to change, and that it will happen. So I don't know if that gives you and everybody some kind of insight as a trainer, but first, your own identity and your experience put on the table, just raw, and then work with it.
Yeah, thank you. Merci, Patricia. Yeah, I think that that's very important. And that's one of the things that I often say is vulnerability goes a long way. I think that we have a tendency not to want to make ourselves vulnerable, but I think that brings in the human connection. And when, as a trainer or as a teacher, we can make ourselves vulnerable, especially when we're the expert. I mean, I frequently tell people, yes, I've worked in cross-cultural environments my entire life. I've lived in a lot of different countries, but I still make mistakes. That there's not a one answer for any of this. It's human nature. It's human, interaction, and not everything is cultural. So we try to do the best we can, and I think that opens up the space to encourage people to share as well. So absolutely, thank you for sharing that. I have a few people who have responded here as well, so let me just quickly go into the chat box, and thank you for everybody for being so interactive here. Wish I could respond to everybody, but we don't have time for all of that. Yvonne said, with the groups, with Germans, for example, I let them know I have a master's degree in career development. With other groups, I talk more about my 30 years of experience. Absolutely, as you see, I put that down, oops, in my previous slide, I put that down is your credentials, how much to do that. Hamilton says that would backfire in Australia. I know that for certain cultures, and France and Germany are really good examples of that one of the first things that you will say is what your academic training is for you to be an expert in this particular topic. Without saying that, you lose credibility. I, with American groups, would never even mention that I have an advanced degree. And, you know, it doesn't matter, nor which university it's from, which it would matter very much so if I were to say that with a group in France, for example. So, so know how to present yourself and how to present those credentials. Sometimes it might just be, you know, your experience or whatnot. So really do your homework there. I think that that's really important. Someone who is starting out as a trainer, how do I establish credentials? Yes, so so thank you for that question. Hopefully some of what we'll talk about in just a moment will answer this, as well as other people's responses. Having knowledge, even if limited, with the demographic that you're working with. One thing I do to establish credibility is that I have researched the audience and how my presentation relates to their specific issues. I approach them from a place of service versus the sage on the stage. I think that that's a really important one. And at the same time, there's a fine line with that, because if they see you in that role as you're the expert, you also have to establish that up front. So I think that there's a little bit of a dialogue here that can take place, and similar to what Patricia was saying, of making ourselves vulnerable allows us to to also share that, like I said before, I'll invite people to ask questions because I also acknowledge that for many cultures, it's not comfortable for people to ask questions, or there's a right question to ask, and that you could really put yourself at risk if you don't ask the right question, so that there's no such thing as a stupid question. Sue has said that I like to introduce myself by way of stories that are related to the clients in front of me about a relevant problem that I help to solve. Yes, Sue, please do unmute to give an example. I think that would be very helpful, particularly because I know you work so much with Japanese audiences.
Hello, this is Sue. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. And thank you, Patricia. That was lovely to say Happy New Year to everybody. Happy New Year and welcome. So I will sometimes, if I'm with a group of, say, scientists, I'm recently in pharmaceutical, and I will say something along the lines of, well, I didn't help cure cancer, but I did work with a small group of researchers who were having to do clinical trials in Japan and were having difficulties communicating with the hospitals and the doctors that they had to work with. So it kind of brings people to a place of, okay, I'm a person who understands your problems and knows what you're working on, and also gets their attention because and in the US, of course, you want to make people laugh a little bit. I don't know, and Julia, you can give your comments on that. Whether humor obviously isn't going to establish credibility in every culture, but I find that if I'm working with a group of Japanese, for example, I will tend to be much more humble in my introductions, but sometimes self-effacing humor can work. So it would kind of go the other way of I'm not sure that I help to solve the problems, but I hope that my 30 years of experience would contribute to their situation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sue. And your story also reminds me of, I think I may have read it in one of Trumpanar's books, talking about somebody working with a Japanese and an American audience, and said, in the introduction, if I were working with an American audience, I would start by telling a joke. And if I would work with a Japanese audience, I would start by apologizing. So I'm going to apologize for not telling a joke. And
Yeah.
kind of was able to really bring in everybody in that example. And I think that the more you can bridge that, you can find that bridge in a way can be humorous, and at the same time can really show, hey, I know you, I understand you. But I think that humility is really important, and the first point of confidence versus arrogance, there's sometimes a very fine line between that, because on the one hand we have to establish ourselves, share our successes, share why we're in that space, without coming off as me, arrogant, and particularly in cultures where humility is valued. So, self-deprecating humor can work in some situations, or it may not in others, and again, I think that that's where we have to know our audience enough to know, is this appropriate? If I'm training people in the UK, absolutely, that's really critical for me to be self-deprecating, to kind of have a false modesty in a sense of downplaying what I'm able to do, almost in a way of putting myself down, because that is sort of the irony and the sense of humor. That wouldn't necessarily work, for example, in Germany, where if I were to do that, then they'd say, well, what do you mean that you're not qualified for this? So I think that again, it's really important for us to recognize what that is. Also, when to use I and when to use we, I think is very important. Sharing some local knowledge. I mean, obviously we can't always do that, but as much as you can find out about current events or things that are going on, it shows that we've done our homework, and ways that we can weave that in. I'm not personally a big sports person. I don't watch sports. It's not my interest. But when I was in Toronto last summer, when the Toronto Raptors were playing in the National Basketball League final playoffs against the Golden State Warriors, the whole city was abuzz. And I happened to be downtown with a client right around the stadium where the game was taking place. Traffic was terrible. People were showing up late. That's all people had on their minds and they talked about. So the night before, I went in and I did some research to find out about the Raptors and, and why everybody was so crazy. And I brought that into the workshop during that day. So again, that's really important to really bring in that sense of, I might not be from here, but I can speak your language to some degree. We've talked about, how we present our credentials. Another thing that I think is really important for the credibility is, especially, going back to what somebody mentioned before about the resistance. I think, Manon, you mentioned working with doctors, the resistance for people to do things and to really engage, is invite people. And even just saying that, it's sometimes just a small word, but instead of saying, okay, what I want you to do now is this, I oftentimes will say, what I'd like to invite you to do is this, if you feel comfortable with it. So you're giving people an out. And I think that can really help them feel, just to loosen their breath, to feel a little bit more comfortable, like, oh, I'm not being forced to do something that doesn't feel comfortable for me. So to really work with people within their own level of comfort, we encourage you to participate as much as possible because you'll get more from this activity and it will enhance your learning. However, if it's something that you really feel uncomfortable about, if you feel like you need to observe that, then that's fine. I think being very clear of what your role is. If you're going into a group where they're used to you giving all of the answers, I think that you need to establish that up front. I am here to facilitate your learning. I am not here to give you the answers. And I have people say that all the time in introductions. I want you to tell me what to do. Let them know what your expectation is of them as well, right from the beginning. And then trends and taboos. Okay, now this is obviously something that we don't know. I'm sure that we all have lots of faux pas, and I'm going to just mention a couple of ones that I have done over the years and learned from as a result. Fortunately, many years ago, I was doing it was an expat training with Germans. And I put and Americans, and I put a German flag up on the slide. This was in the early 2000s, and I think it was not until maybe it was the World Cup in 2006 or 2010. I can't remember exactly, where it was a really big deal because Germans were painting their faces with the flag for the first time, but that was still somewhat sensitive because of the connotation from World War II, so that people would not fly the flags quite as frequently. And fortunately, I had a co-facilitator who was German who said, no, you can't put that up. That would not be, appropriate. People would feel uncomfortable with that. So I quickly changed my slide and took that flag down. Another time I was in India, and I was talking about social stratification and hierarchy and all of that, and I mentioned the caste system, and it was a group of just Indians in this workshop, and I realized that, obviously the caste system is there, but it's sort of the elephant in the room, and you don't want to bring it up and relate it in any way to the workforce. So as a foreigner saying that, I got some everybody became very quiet and nobody would talk about it. And I realized that perhaps that was not an appropriate thing to bring up, because particularly since the caste system was officially eradicated many years ago, back in the late 40s, people still didn't necessarily feel comfortable discussing that, and particularly in the work environment. So do your homework on that. Sometimes you can ask people if you have somebody from the culture, or you can ask the client, would this be appropriate or inappropriate to bring up this topic? Okay. Oops. Sorry, just bear with me here. There we go. So for the training delivery, again, we've talked a little bit about this. Is it appropriate to have more didactic or more experiential? In cultures where there's more rote memorization, you might have it take a little bit longer for people to get into the space where you're not seen as the teacher, but rather the facilitator. This is something that I would, there are some environments where I do a role play, really as a fun exercise, kind of a meet and greet activity where people get really energized at first. And that's extremely uncomfortable for people from an environment where they don't know somebody. So I have to really understand, is this going to be a high risk for me to be able to do this? Similarly, when I've taught my grad students in the past, I oftentimes have had them write journals and keep journals. And I've really had to coach some of my students, particularly those from China, who are not necessarily used to writing about their feelings and what their learning is. And so they're looking at it more as sort of writing a term paper. So have had to kind of go that extra mile to explain what it is that I'm looking for, because that's not necessarily intuitive for everybody. Preparing additional instructions. Again, important not to get mired in explanations and just assuming that people will understand. And I think a really good example for me around this has been when I have run Barnga, which some of you or many of you may be familiar with. It was a card game invented many, many years ago by Tyagi. And I have learned over the years that to now have a slide up that explains what the different terms are, because people don't necessarily know what a club is or a spade is, or it might be called something different in their language. They might also not know what a trump is or a trick. So I put up the terminology and I'm very, very explicit around that. So just be mindful of that with instructions, particularly for people who might not be native English speakers. Similarly, learning activities that are applicable for diverse groups. One thing that I've found, and I think Patricia, you mentioned this before as well, is anything that can be sensory. You know, using music. One time, a number of years ago, I had a co-facilitator who brought in a whole bunch of different instruments from different places around the world, which was so much fun, and just invited as sort of almost like a jolt and an energizer during the workshop to have people pick up an instrument and to play it. And it was such a great opportunity because people did. It just happened to turn out that there was a congo and that there was somebody who played djembe drums. And so pick that up. And it was a way of which people were able to kind of come together, even if they weren't musicians, and create something and make music together. We had maracas, we had congos, we had chimes, we had some percussion, and it was really a lot of fun to do that. Also, face issues and risk aversion. I think somebody mentioned that before, Hamilton, I think you mentioned, you know, sharing information in advance with people, especially if you want to do something that's more unscripted or spontaneous. As I said, I always invite people to do this, but not necessarily enforce it. And but I've also had, I had a young Frenchman one time in a workshop say to me in the feedback afterwards that he was very upset because he felt that it was put people on the spot, that they were doing a role play, and he felt very uncomfortable having to do that and not have the time for preparation. So that reminded me that, especially if you're doing an activity where everybody, the expectation is to do a role play, even if it's just a one-on-one role play, ask people if this is something that they're able to do. Tell them, please try to adopt this behavior as much as you're able to, but also really weave that into the conversation afterwards. But most importantly is you want people to stay engaged and to feel safe. And if they feel that they have lost face in any way, then you've lost them. Similarly, asking sometimes a question to somebody, putting them on the spot. Please tell me how it's done in your culture. That might be something that somebody might feel very uncomfortable because they don't necessarily have the answer. They haven't really thought about it. So I try to avoid, especially if it's, cultures that I might not be as familiar with, to ask people specific questions. And to allow them to come in. And, oftentimes we'll say, if there's somebody who hasn't spoken, please, to add something, but not to put people on the spot in any way. Managing time, always a challenge, right? For us as facilitators as well. I always have a cushion in when I have non-native English speakers because I recognize that it might take them longer. I also sometimes, as somebody mentioned before, allow them to write down their answers to prepare them. Also recognize that for break time, people will probably not come back. One time, many years ago, when I had initially started to do some consulting work with the World Bank, I was doing a workshop where I had people in Dakar in Senegal, and I was co-facilitating with a bank employee who was very time conscious. I think he was Russian, but had grown up in Germany and was very used to sort of punctuality. And when we gave the break, they all disappeared, and we had the big screen there. And we had to get on the phone with them and get back because nobody was coming back, and we needed to move on with the workshop. So being very mindful of that, and also being mindful of, as I said before, with US or perhaps more English speaking groups, you can move a little bit more quickly than you can with groups who don't speak the language. Some people, like I work a lot with the French, and they want to spend time debating and going much deeper into the topic. Similarly, somebody who's more indirect is going to take much longer to get to the point. So, so being very mindful of that and cushioning that in as well. And then communication, obviously cultural jargon. Even when we speak English, we can have errors. I had a great teaching moment one time when I was working with a Scottish couple doing a workshop, and the admin came into the room to buy us lunch. And this was here in the States. And the gentleman said, "Oh, I'll just have a ham salad sandwich, please." And the poor woman went out and pored over all of the different takeout menus and was wondering where he'd seen it, and finally came back into the room and said, "I'm sorry, do you know a place specifically that has ham salad?" And what he meant was a ham sandwich with lettuce and tomato on it. So, so very, very, easy for us to forget that, to use certain terminology, sports terminology, for example, or things where we forget. So simplifying our language, things that we often teach others, but we also need to apply ourselves. Similarly, how quickly we speak. I tend to be a fast speaker. That's something that I have learned over the years, and it's also something that I've really had to be very mindful of when I'm working with groups who are not necessarily native English speakers. And where this has also been particularly challenging is when I have sometimes groups where I have very, very strong speakers, and I also have some people who don't speak very well. So I've always gone over and talked to the people during the break if they don't have a strong level of English, and just ask if everything's okay, if there was anything that they didn't understand, so that I can be sure to really engage them as well. Okay. So I have some comments here. Opposite of rushing to be prompt, glad you're saying it, adding the cushion. Yes. Preparing extra time. I think that's so important in these situations. Okay, so communicating mindfully. There's so many power issues around language. For those of you who may work in other languages as well, using the formal or the informal form of you. And this I find particularly salient in Latin America, because there are some cultures in Latin America where you would always use usted, even with people who are younger, and others where you would immediately go into the tu form. So recognizing that, understanding when it's appropriate, when it's not. You can also ask in certain situations if you don't know how it's done in that particular country. Deferring to people obviously who are older and more senior in rank, which we talked a little bit about before. And also recognizing that people who are of lower rank might not feel comfortable sharing openly in hierarchical environments. So I think as a trainer or as a teacher, we need to find ways in which we can engage people who might not speak up because their boss is in the room or somebody of a higher level, and would just never allow that, would never do that. And Yvonne has asked how you do that. So what I might do is have people work in pairs in small groups that way, instead of in a larger audience. And I might ask them to write it down as well. And instead of saying it, so that people can write, I oftentimes will have people write on Post-its, for example, questions that they have or comments that they have, so that they don't feel that there's a potential risk involved with them. And I think that that's a much safer environment to do that. Obviously allow extra reading time. I tend to avoid very long, like case studies or role plays if I have non-native speakers, because I realize that it's going to take a much longer time for people to read, or I might send it to them and email it to them the day before in advance, or give it to them during the break and ask them to read it, you know, for that afternoon. Something like that I think is quite important as well. And then for body language, expressive or instrumental. This is a really interesting one because for me, it was also sort of an eye-opener. I was in Bogota this past summer for the first time, and some of the comments, and I think I'm quite expressive. I speak a lot with my hands when I'm training, and inflections to work. And the comments that I had from several people were tentative, not very enthusiastic. Now, in this particular workshop, I happened to be working with a very vivacious Brazilian gentleman who jumped up and down a lot, spoke very much with his hands, used a lot of jokes, laughed, was quite loud. So it may have been comparing his style to my style, but it just reminded me of the need to do that perhaps a little bit more, you know, be more informal or more formal in my approach when I'm working with certain cultures. Similarly, managing silence and interruption. Really important to give that space. I have learned that on webinars. I conduct a lot of webinars in particular, but I've also learned that in workshops that people need to process, especially if they're not native speakers. And for many of us here in the United States, we might feel uncomfortable with long pauses and silence. So that is something that I, over the years, have really tried to cultivate in my practice as a facilitator, because sometimes those pauses can be very excruciating. But really allow for them to happen, because people will speak up, and be very mindful when the interruptions occur too. I frequently have people talking all at once, or somebody will be speaking and I'll have one table that still is carrying on the conversation and having the discussion. So really important also to set that up as a rule. If you have a co-facilitator, or if there's the client or somebody in the room, you know, I oftentimes will ask them in advance that if you see that happening, if you wouldn't mind just going over to the table, or I might just walk over to the table and just kind of stand there as well, because you obviously don't want to shush somebody in front of a large group. Pointing fingers, you know, oftentimes we might easily forget and we just point with somebody, but how that can be very offensive in certain cultures. So I oftentimes use the open palm as a way. I never, ever systematically never point. In fact, I work frequently, co-facilitate with a colleague who's become a friend now, who's a German gentleman and quite tall, and he used to point a lot. And I'd say to him, you know, as a woman, that sometimes can also feel very offensive, but also across cultures. And over time, he is, I notice, has started to use the open palm a lot more as well. And then just be very mindful about gender issues around touch. You know, that especially there are some role plays that I have where I give people, and I don't necessarily observe carefully what roles I'm giving to people and where they may be from. And you can use that as part of a discussion afterwards as well. You know, how are you able to step into that space to touch somebody, to give somebody a hug, for example, where that would not be the norm in your culture. And then lastly, terminology. And I realize I'm going through some of these quickly, and hopefully this is allowing you to just reflect a little bit more on what's been best practices for you. But what sort of terminology can you and should you be using? For example, also not being offensive. I was in Brazil one time, and I had a participant in my workshop refer to Black Americans as Negroes. And I found myself just really jolted and really taken back by it. and you know, quickly kind of realized that he was not saying it in a way that was, you know, the way I took it, offensively. And afterwards, during a break, I went and talked to him and said, you know, by the way, you know, that might be used in Portuguese in terms of how you describe people of a different race, but that would be considered very offensive if you were to do that in the United States, and because there's not that awareness. And so when people are speaking another language as well, they oftentimes will use a direct translation of the word that is commonly used in their own culture. So just reminding ourselves of the intention of what people may be saying is not necessarily how we or others are interpreting it. Also, sometimes there are culturally sensitive words. For example, for many years, the word collaboration, collaboration, was not necessarily viewed positively from the French perspective because of historical connotations of World War II, where collaborateur, collaborator, was somebody who was working with the Vichy government and therefore with the Nazis. So, so being very mindful, is there another word that you can use around that that might not trigger somebody who might view it in that way. You know, certainly terms that we don't recognize outside of our own culture. Sports terminology is a great example. You know, we frequently here in the US use a lot of football and baseball terminology, but you know, learning cricket terminology, for example, in India might be more appropriate, and just applying those in a way that people would be able to understand them. So, so this is pretty much what I have prepared, and I know that a lot of you have put some questions in, but I'd really like to open the space now for just a couple of minutes, and then we'll come to some questions as well, for people to share some of their stories. You know, what lessons have you learned from training or teaching multicultural groups? And some of you have already begun to share that, and I'll try to read through this extensive chat box as well and see if there's anything that I haven't been able to do, but please feel free to unmute your phone if there's a particularly relevant story that you would like to share that might be beneficial to everybody else on the call.
Julia, this is Sandy. One of the things that I found over the years that was pretty helpful was learning how to work to co-train. I spent some time learning from Wilma Gormley and Jim, and they really stressed how you need to really work with, talk to, become comfortable with any co-trainers that you're working with. And a good example for me, it was when I was doing training at the military medical school, so working with doctors and doctors-to-be, working with a doctor as my co-trainer. And if I hadn't had the training of how to work with a co-trainer, I'm not sure we could have gotten along, but it worked really well. And it's really nice to have somebody who's got your back if they have a specific body of knowledge that you don't. And in the case of the medical profession, when something would come up that I couldn't answer because I'm not an MD, the doctor could step in and take it. And we learned how to we used to call it frick and frack, so that we each came from our strengths and we built on the strengths.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sandy. That is so important, is that our style switching also has to be, especially when we're co-facilitating. And for those of you who, I do it frequently with one client that I work with, and there's a team of about 7 of us, and many of us have become like a family over the years because we've been working together for so long now. But we definitely spent some time going through some learning pains with some of us because some of us had such different styles. So we really needed to find that adaptation with each other as well. So I think that that's an important reminder. Anybody else have any lessons that you've learned that might be helpful for others on the call?
I have something.
Yes, please. And who is this?
This is Mary Pat Quinn.
Hi, Mary.
Several times people have mentioned to me how it would have been helpful had they learned the difference in 3 different positions. What the person in their native culture would be in a relaxed position, a thoughtful position, and a defensive posture. How 3 areas would differ so they could read their body language a little more accurately.
That's a great example, especially if it's a culture that's so different, because, again, our body language can mean different things to different people, right? Silence might be, hey, I'm listening, or it might be that, I'm tuned out, or I'm angry, or I'm disengaged. I remember for a number of times when I've worked, and Sue, if you're still on, perhaps you can address this as well. When I have worked with Japanese people and I've seen them kind of close their eyes, and I thought, are they sleeping? What's taking place here? And then realized and have learned, and again, Sue, perhaps you can chime in here, but that it's more of, I'm really just processing what I'm hearing and I'm reflecting on it. And no, I'm not bored with what you're saying and doing.
There was a time when there were some negotiations between the Dutch and the Americans, and the Dutch have a position that to someone from the States would look like it was defensive, but that's actually, the classic arms crossed over their chest. But for them, that's the position that their teachers ask them to be in elementary school. Similar to in the States, you sort of cup your hands at your desk. So during negotiations, one party thought the other was so defensive and they started dropping prices, but it was simply a relaxed position.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's so important to recognize that, because we can also be thrown off balance as trainers when we don't understand those different nuances around body language. Sue, I see that you have something to say about silence. So please go right ahead.
No, that was a lovely point that, I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the person who just spoke. Mary?
Mary Pat.
Mary Pat, thank you, about body language, and that body language and also silence meaning things that they don't mean or they don't mean. And what I loved when I think about Japanese culture is there are all these interesting words like ma and mu that mean silence or space, and they are rich in meaning. It's like the silence is meant to be there. The space between words is as important as the words. And in U.S. culture in particular, we tend to fill up silence with words, and that carries unintended consequences. So I think that this notion of silence and how different cultures use it, and I'm still looking for different ways, and maybe Julia, you have some ideas, in very multicultural situations, one has to really regulate and accommodate the range of styles, so that the people who are uncomfortable with silence have a way of being comfortable, but the people who are uncomfortable with noise and interruption also have a way to get in.
Yeah, and that's a really tough one, Sue. I had about a year and a half ago, I was training a group of predominantly Japanese, and I had 3 or 4, I can't remember, French people in the audience. So really challenging, because the French people were speaking up, they were talking a lot, they were processing, they were debating, and the Japanese tended to be silent. So I broke them into a lot of smaller groups, and I gave them sort of instructions that they each had 2 minutes to share. So that was allowing people to be able to speak up as well. And I was kind of a timekeeper around that.
Yeah, you have to have different methods and be willing to use different methods. And I think it's important to establish kind of guidelines or protocol, so that there's not, because I've noticed that a lot of people, Western cultures especially, will be like, well, isn't it kind of condescending if I da-da-da-da? And for people, especially, there's a whole factor around, English is not the first language, and respect, and how you show good listening behaviors. So just trying to find some happy medium or understanding, and making sure that everybody feels respected.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm being mindful of time here, and I probably have time for maybe one other question if anybody has one, or one other comment. So if anybody would like to share, please take the moment to do that now.
Yep. Here is Catalina. I guess I like everything that you said today. It's very, very important and relevant, and reaffirm the learning of how important is silence and how that will be a way to communicate in different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So being curious all the time, curiosity also create rapport and empathy with people. And that is not just one way to do things. Being with a multicultural, in a multicultural space is always a reminder that it's not just one way to reach the point. It's not one way to do things. Then being aware of that and knowing that we don't know everything. As much as we know that we know less than what we think that we know.
Yeah. Thank you, Catalina, for that reminder. And actually, that's a point that I frequently make with my groups. To go back to I think it was Patricia saying about being vulnerable. I oftentimes will, in my introduction, will say that. I'll say, look, I'm you know, this is my life, this is my career, this is my passion, this is what I've been doing for many years. I've had the opportunity and the good fortune of working with people around the world, but there's a lot of things that I don't know. So we use this opportunity as a chance to know and to learn from each other as well. And I think that for me is one of the greatest gifts of this work, is that it's constantly challenging my own biases, my own assumptions about things, and in different ways. So thank you for that reminder. And that kind of segues nicely into this final slide as well. I'm also a yoga instructor, and I practice a lot of mindfulness, and I found that that's been very relevant in this work, is to step into that space, because it allows us to be much more present. I mean, there are times, especially when we're challenged, to just come into our breath and to realize, ooh, this person is, or I'm in this room that I feel there's a hostility because people don't want me to be here or whatever. To really be very present, it allows us to observe much more. It allows us to be much more active in terms of our listening, not just to what we're hearing and what's being spoken, but what's not being spoken, as well as to body language. And to, you know, if we don't understand something, if we see somebody's upset or looks triggered, it gives us an opportunity to perhaps engage with that person during the break and to do a check-in. Also, you know, really finding ourselves being grounded. I'm sure that we've all had experiences where we felt that, wow, somebody just asked a question or made a comment, and that's really triggering me. And we have to find our own sort of groundedness and rootedness through that to be able to stay engaged and to respond, and not to be attached to what we're hearing. You know, I do a fair amount of work around unconscious bias as well. And I can say that sometimes I get really upset with some of the things that I hear. So I have to try to find a sense of not being attached to that, and to always find empathy. So these are just some practical skills. But I really want to thank everybody. We've hopefully asked some questions, and thank you all for participating today. Thank you all for sharing also your own best practices and your knowledge and your challenges. I think, again, hopefully we've had the opportunity to learn from each other, and you know, happy to. You know, if anybody wants to reach out to me, I put my email down there, so you can feel free to contact me if you have other questions or comments as well. Karen will put, and Sandy will put the slides on the website. But look forward to continuing this dialogue at conferences or in other environments.
Julia, we'd like to thank you. This is Sandy. This was the most interactive webinar we've had so far. And so I really would like to thank everybody for their participation, but you especially. We clearly were hearing from a very experienced, considerate, sensitive, skillful trainer. And I think we all appreciated that very, very much. I know I did. I would like to announce that the next webinar in February will be February 4th. And the person speaking will be Amer Ahmed. Amer is going to speak about the intercultural frameworks for diversity, equity, and inclusion work. I think a very interesting look at that intersection between intercultural and DEI. he was our closing keynote speaker at the most recent SIETAR USA conference in Atlanta. And anyone who knows him knows that this will be a very interesting, stimulating webinar. And I hope you'll all join us in February. And I thank you again.
Okay, thanks everyone. Take care.